I'm Elenora Reed, 42, and for 3 years I've been the trusted housekeeper for Congressman Richard Whitmore and his picture-perfect family. I thought I knew every corner of their pristine home until last Tuesday when I discovered a hidden door behind the wine cellar that led to something that made my blood run cold. What I found down there wasn't just evidence of corruption, it was proof of something so much darker, something that would shatter the lives of everyone I'd grown to care about. The man I'd served breakfast to every morning, who asked about my grandchildren and left generous Christmas bonuses, had been living a lie that went deeper than politics. And now, with what I know, I'm the only one who can decide whether justice is worth destroying the innocent people caught in his web. If you've ever wondered what really happens behind closed doors in the halls of power, like this video and stay with me, because this story will change how you see everything. 3 years ago, I stood on the marble steps of the Whitmore mansion in Georgetown, clutching my purse with nervous fingers and hoping I wouldn't mess up this opportunity. I'd been a widow for 6 months, and my daughter Emma was starting her second year of medical school at Johns Hopkins. The tuition bills were crushing me, and the housekeeping jobs I'd been taking barely covered our basic expenses. The woman who answered the door was Margaret Whitmore, tall and elegant with perfectly styled blonde hair and tired eyes that seemed older than her 45 years. She wore a cream-colored sweater that probably cost more than I made in a month, but her smile was genuine when she welcomed me inside. "You must be Elenora," she said, extending a manicured hand. "Thank you so much for coming. We've been through 3 housekeepers in the past year, and honestly, I'm desperate for someone reliable." The house was breathtaking, all gleaming hardwood floors, crystal chandeliers, and oil paintings that looked like they belonged in a museum. Everything was perfectly arranged, not a cushion out of place, not a speck of dust visible anywhere. It felt more like a showroom than a home where people actually lived. Margaret led me through room after room, explaining their needs and expectations. The formal dining room where they entertained political donors and colleagues. The library where Congressman Whitmore prepared his speeches. The children's bedrooms on the second floor, immaculate, but somehow lacking the warmth you'd expect from teenage spaces. "Richard, my husband, he's very particular about his privacy," Margaret explained as we passed a closed door. "His home office is off limits, and the wine cellar in the basement is his personal sanctuary. He handles a lot of sensitive political business from home, you understand?" I nodded, though something in her tone made me wonder if there was more to it than that. The way she glanced nervously at the door, the slight tension in her shoulders, it reminded me of how I used to act around my late husband when he was in one of his moods. That's when I met the children. Sarah was 16 then, a beautiful girl with her father's dark hair and her mother's delicate features. She was polite but distant, the way teenagers often are with new adults in their space. Michael was 14, quieter than his sister, with an intensity in his dark eyes that seemed too serious for his age. "Sarah's applying to colleges next year," Margaret said with obvious pride. "She wants to study international relations, maybe follow in her father's footsteps someday. And Michael, he's brilliant with computers, though his grades have been struggling lately." The congressman himself didn't appear until later that evening, just as I was finishing up my first day. Richard Whitmore was exactly what you'd expect. From a successful politician, tall, silver-haired, with a kind of confident smile that looked practiced but not insincere. His handshake was firm, his eye contact direct. "Elenora, welcome to our family," he said. And there was something about the way he said family that made it feel genuine. "Margaret tells me you have a daughter in medical school. That's wonderful. We need more dedicated doctors in this world." He asked about Emma's studies, about my previous work experience, about my plans for the future. He listened to my answers with what seemed like genuine interest, nodding thoughtfully and asking follow-up questions. When I mentioned how challenging the medical school expenses were, he didn't just offer sympathy. He quietly increased the salary we discussed by 20%. "Good help is invaluable," he said simply. "We want you to feel secure here, Elenora. When you're worried about money, you can't focus on the work that matters." That first Christmas, he gave me a bonus that covered Emma's entire spring semester tuition. When I tried to thank him, tears in my eyes, he waved off my gratitude. "You take care of our family," he said. It's only right that we take care of yours. But even in those early days, I noticed things. The way Margaret sometimes flinched when Richard raised his voice, even when he wasn't angry. The expensive security system that seemed excessive for the neighborhood. The late-night visitors who came and went through the back entrance. Men in expensive suits who never stayed long and never spoke to the family. The framed Christmas photo from that first year still sits on my dresser at home, the five of us. In front of their enormous tree, me included, like I truly was part of the family. Richard's arm around Margaret, the children smiling genuinely for once, and me standing beside them in my best dress, grateful and proud to be there. Looking at that photo now, knowing what I know, I can see what I missed then. The tension in Margaret's smile. It's the way Richard's hand gripped her shoulder just a little too tightly. It's the shadows under all their eyes that spoke of secrets and stress I couldn't have imagined. But back then, saw only kindness and opportunity. I saw a family that needed me and a man who seemed to genuinely care about his employees. I saw my ticket to giving Emma the future she deserved, and I was grateful beyond words. How naive I was. By my second year with the Whitmores, I had settled into a rhythm that felt as natural as breathing. Every weekday morning at 6 sharp, I would let myself in through the back entrance, punch in the security code that Richard had entrusted me with, and begin my carefully orchestrated routine. I kept a handwritten schedule tucked in my apron paquita, detailed breakdown of every task, timed to perfection. Richard liked his coffee strong and black, ready by 6:30 when he came down for his morning run preparation. Margaret preferred green tea with honey, served in the delicate china cup her grandmother had left her. The children needed their lunches, packed in breakfast ready before their 7:15 departure for school. Richard was always kind to me, in a way that felt genuine rather than performative. He'd ask about Emma's progress in medical school, remembering details about her rotations and exams. When she was struggling with organic chemistry. He somehow arranged for her to get tutoring from a professor at Georgetown. Favor that probably. Cost him nothing but meant everything to us. How's our future doctor doing? He'd ask every Monday morning, and I'd update him on Emma's week while he stretched against the kitchen counter in his running gear. He had this way of making you feel heard, like your problems mattered to him personally. Margaret was different, more distant, but not unkind. She moved through the house like a ghost sometimes, beautiful and untouchable. I learned to read her moods in the way she held her shoulders, the speed of her steps on the hardwood floors. On her bad days, I'd leave her tea outside her bedroom, door and handle everything as quietly as possible. The children, though, they became my soft spot. Sarah was preparing for her SATs and college applications, the stress of it making her snappish some days, vulnerable others. I'd find her crying over her laptop in the kitchen at midnight, overwhelmed by essay deadlines and the pressure to get into an Ivy League school. My dad expects perfection. She confided in me one evening while I helped her with calculus homework that was beyond my understanding, but not my ability to provide moral support. Sometimes I feel like I'm performing in a play where I don't know my lines. Michael was the one who really worried me. Brilliant beyond his years, but increasingly withdrawn, spending hours in his room with his computer. His grades had started slipping badly, and I'd hear him on the phone sometimes, his voice tight with anxiety about assignments he hadn't completed. He's just going through a phase, Richard would say, when Margaret brought up Michael's struggles. Teenagers need to find their own way. But I saw how Michael flinched when his father's voice got too loud. How he disappeared to his room whenever Richard had business associates over. The boy was drowning, and somehow I was the only one who seemed to notice. My access to the house was complete. I had keys to every room except Richard's private office and explicit permission to clean anywhere the family spent time. They trusted me with their most intimate spaces, their personal belongings, their unguarded moments. I'd seen Margaret's prescription bottles, knew about her anxiety medication and sleeping pills. I'd found Sarah's hidden diary and never said a word. I'd discovered Michael's collection of violent video games that his parents had forbidden. The wine cellar was Richard's domain, a temperature-controlled sanctuary in the basement where he kept his collection of rare vintages and conducted what he called his evening business. I was allowed to dust and organize down there, but he'd made it clear that certain cabinets were off limits. Some of these bottles are worth more than your car. Elenora, he joked, but there was an edge to his voice that made it clear this wasn't really a joke. And I sometimes have sensitive political documents stored down there. Better to be safe. You understand? I understood, or thought I did. Politicians had to be careful about confidential information about maintaining security. The late-night visitors started making more sense, donors, lobbyists, other congressmen conducting business away from the prying eyes of Capitol Hill. But sometimes, when I was working in the rooms above the wine cellar, I'd hear voices through the vents. Conversations that sounded heated, urgent. Once I heard what sounded like someone crying a man's voice, broken and desperate. When I asked Richard about it the next morning, he brushed off my concern. Sometimes politics involves difficult decisions, Elenora. People don't always like hearing hard truths about their situations. That satisfied me then. I trusted Richard, believed in his fundamental decency. He'd been nothing but kind to me and my family. He'd saved us from financial ruin and treated me with more respect than I'd ever received from an employer. Looking back now, I can see how carefully he cultivated that trust. The generous salary, the personal interest in my life, the inclusion. In family moments, it was all designed to make me feel valued, secure, grateful. And it worked perfectly. I would have done anything for that family. I would have kept any secret, told any lie, protected them from any threat. The irony is devastating lie, thought I was protecting them from the world outside. I had no idea I was living in the house with the very monster they needed protection. From my handwritten schedule with its careful timing and detailed notes represented more than just household efficiency. It was a map of my complete integration into their lives. Evidence of how thoroughly I'd been trusted with their world. And that trust, that access, that intimate knowledge of their routines, it would be exactly what I needed when everything fell apart. Last Tuesday started like any other day. Richard had left early for a series of committee meetings on Capitol Hill. Margaret was at her book club and the children were at school. The house felt peaceful in that particular way. It did when I had. It to myself, no need to tiptoe around anyone's mood or schedule. Just me and my work. I decided to tackle the wine cellar. Something I only did when Richard was away for extended periods. He preferred to be present when I worked in his sanctuary. Not because he didn't trust me, but because he enjoyed talking about his collection. Each bottle had a story where he'd acquired it, what occasion he was saving it for, which political ally had gifted it to him. The cellar was immaculate, as always. Bottles arranged in perfect rows according to region and vintage. Richard's organizational system was more complex than most libraries. I started with the upper shelves, using the sturdy stepladder he kept down there for reaching the highest rows. Everything was going smoothly until I reached for a cloth that had fallen behind a rack of Bordeaux from the 1980s. As I stretched to retrieve it, my shoulder caught the neck of a 1982 Chateau Latour, one of Richard's prized possessions worth more than I. Made in 3 months. The bottle tumbled in what felt like slow motion, my desperate grab missing by inches. It shattered against the stone floor with a sound that seemed to echo through the entire basement. Deep red wine spread across the gray stones like blood, seeping into the grout lines and flowing toward the far wall. My heart pounded as I stared at the destruction. Richard would be furious, and rightfully so. I destroyed something irreplaceable through my carelessness. I grabbed towels from the utility closet and dropped to my knees, frantically trying to soak up the wine before it could stain the stone permanently. That's when I noticed something impossible. The wine was disappearing under what I had always assumed was a solid wall. As I watched, the dark liquid seeped through what looked like a hairline crack running vertically along the stone. So subtle it was barely visible unless you knew exactly where to look. I sat back on my heels, confused. Wine doesn't flow through solid stone. I pressed my hand against the wall where the liquid had vanished and felt the slightest give-not stone at all. But something designed to look like stone? My practical mind tried to rationalize it. Maybe there was some kind of drainage system Richard had installed or a utility space for the house's mechanical systems. Old Georgetown houses had all kinds of architectural quirks, but as I knelt there in the spreading wine, listening to the silence of the empty house, I heard something that made my blood freeze. It was faint, muffled by whatever lay beyond that. False wall, but unmistakable the sound of machinery humming. Like computers or ventilation systems running, Richard had told me the wine cellar was the lowest point of the house, built into bedrock. There shouldn't be anything below us except earth and stone. Yet there was clearly some kind of space behind this wall, a space that was active and operational. I pressed my ear against the cool surface and heard more what sounded like electronic beeping, the kind you'd hear from sophisticated equipment. Then, more disturbing, the faint sound of a voice. Not clear enough to make out words, but definitely human, definitely coming from somewhere beyond this wall. My hands shook as I cleaned up the broken glass and wine, my mind racing with possibilities. Secret Service equipment, maybe? Some kind? Of security center for the house. Politicians had threats made against them regularly. Maybe Richard had installed some kind of monitoring system, but why hide it from his family? Why the deception about the wine cellar being the basement's only room? As I finished cleaning, I found myself studying every inch of that wall, looking for hinges, handles, any sign of how it might open. The craftsmanship was incredible. Whoever had built this had gone to extraordinary lengths to make it invisible. Part of me wanted to forget what I'd discovered, to pretend the accident had never happened. Richard trusted me, had been good to me and my family. Whatever was behind that wall was clearly meant to be private, okay? And I had no right to pry into his personal business. But another part of me, the part that had noticed Michael's fear, Margaret's anxiety, the strange late-night visitors, couldn't let it go. The responsible thing would be to tell Richard about the accident and let him explain. He'd probably laugh and show me some perfectly innocent security, room or storage space. Yet something in my gut told me that if I mentioned this discovery, if I revealed that I knew about the hidden space, my comfortable life with this family would end immediately. The thought terrified me more than I wanted to admit. I climbed the stairs from the wine cellar on unsteady legs, my cleaning supplies feeling heavier than usual. The broken bottle had been an accident, but what came next would be a choice. I could pretend I'd never seen anything, never heard those sounds. I could continue my routine, grateful for my job and the security it provided. Or I could find out what Richard Whitmore was hiding in the space that didn't exist beneath his perfect home, standing in that pristine kitchen, surrounded by the trappings of the life I'd built with this family. I knew I was at a crossroads. Whatever lay behind that wall would either confirm my trust in Richard or shatter it completely. The worst part was that deep down, beneath my gratitude and loyalty, I already suspected which it would be. I couldn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw wine seeping through that impossible crack, heard those muffled electronic sounds. By 4 a.m, I gave up trying and sat at my kitchen table, staring at my reflection. In the dark window, Emma called while I was nursing my 3rd cup of coffee, her voice bright with excitement about her pediatric rotation. I tried to sound normal, asking about her patients and her studies, but my mind kept drifting back to that wall. "Mom, you sound distracted," she said finally. "Everything okay?" "Just tired, sweetheart. Long day yesterday." After we hung up, I sat in the growing dawn light and thought about everything Richard had done for us. The job, the generous salary, the Christmas bonuses, the connections that had helped Emma with her studies. How could I repay that kindness by snooping into his private affairs? But then I thought about the fear in Michael's eyes, the way Margaret jumped whenever Richard raised his voice, those late-night visitors with their urgent whispers. What if my silence was protecting something that shouldn't be protected? I arrived at the Whitmore house that morning with my heart hammering against my ribs. Richard was at his usual breakfast spot, reading the Washington Post while sipping his coffee. He looked up when I entered, that familiar warm smile spreading across his face. "Good morning, Elenora. Beautiful day, isn't it?" "Good morning, Congressman." My voice sounded normal, thank God. Yes, lovely weather. I went through my morning routine mechanically, my mind focused entirely on getting back to that wine cellar. Richard left for his office around 8:30, Margaret departed for her yoga class, and the children caught their school bus. The house settled into its familiar midweek quiet. I forced myself to wait an hour, completing my usual upstairs tasks before heading to the basement. My hands trembled as I descended the stairs, carrying my cleaning supplies like some kind of shield against discovery. The wine cellar looked exactly as I'd left it, no trace of yesterday's accident remaining. But now I knew what to look for. I went straight to that section of wall, running my fingers along the nearly invisible seam. There had to be a mechanism, some way to open it. I examined every bottle rack, every decorative element, looking for anything that might serve as a trigger. After 20 minutes of fruitless searching, I was ready to give up when I noticed something odd about one of the wine racks near the false wall. It was positioned slightly differently than the others, angled just a few degrees off the pattern. When I pressed against it, it didn't move, but when I tried to rotate it, it turned with the smooth precision of a wheel-oiled mechanism. The soft click that followed was barely audible, but the change in the wall was immediate. A section roughly 3 feet wide swung inward on silent hinges, revealing a narrow opening and a set of stairs descending into darkness. Cool air flowed up from below, carrying the scent of electronics and something else, something sterile and vaguely medicinal that made my stomach clench. The humming sound I'd heard yesterday was louder now, a complex symphony of electronic equipment running continuously. I stood at the threshold for a long moment, my rational mind warring with my growing certainty that I was about to discover something terrible. Every instinct screamed at me to close the door, replace the wine rack, and forget this had ever happened. Instead, pulled out my phone and turned on its flashlight. Whatever was down there, whatever Richard was hiding, I needed to know. The children's safety might depend on it. Margaret's well-being certainly did. I started down the stairs, each step taking me further from the safe, comfortable world I'd known and deeper into something that felt increasingly like a nightmare. The air grew cooler as I descended, and the electronic humming grew louder, accompanied now by other sounds fans, hard drives spinning, the occasional electronic beep. After what felt like a dozen steps, the narrow staircase opened into a space that took my breath away. It was a fully equipped office, larger than Richard's study upstairs, with walls lined with monitors, filing cabinets, and equipment I couldn't begin to identify. Multiple computer screens glowed in the darkness, displaying what looked like security footage from various locations around the city. My legs felt weak as the scope of what I was seeing sank in. This wasn't just some home security system or private study. This was a command center, a space designed for surveillance and coordination on a massive scale. A brass key ring hung from a hook near the entrance. Old-fashioned keys of various sizes that looked like they belonged to file cabinets and desk drawers. My hands shook as I reached for them, the metal cold against my palm. I had crossed a line I could never uncross. Whatever I found in this room would change everything: my relationship with the family, my understanding of the man I'd trusted, my own safety. But there was no going back now. The truth was waiting for me in those filing cabinets, on those computer screens, in whatever records Richard Whitmore had been keeping in his secret underground office. I gripped the keys tighter and stepped fully into the room, my phone's flashlight beam dancing across surfaces that should never have existed, revealing a world of secrets that I was about to make my burden to bear. The wine bottle had been an accident. Everything that happened next would be my choice. And God help me, I chose. To know the truth, the underground office was a masterpiece of hidden technology and careful planning. As my eyes adjusted to the glow of multiple monitors, I began to understand the true scope of what Richard had built beneath his family home. The room was roughly the size of the wine cellar above, but every inch had been utilized with surgical precision. 3 walls were lined floor to ceiling with filing cabinets, their locks gleaming in the electronic light. A massive desk dominated the center space, sporting an array of computer equipment that looked more sophisticated than anything I'd seen outside of movies. But it was the wall of monitors that made my knees weak. 12 screens arranged in a grid, each displaying live footage from different locations around. Washington, D.C., I recognized some of the views: the Capitol building, steps, the exterior of the Supreme Court, what looked like the parking garage of a high-end hotel. Others showed interior spaces, offices, conference rooms, what appeared to be private residences. I moved closer to the monitors, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it over the electronic humming. The cameras weren't just recording public spaces, they were positioned to capture private meetings, personal conversations, intimate moments. As I watched, a well-dressed man I recognized from news broadcasts entered one of the monitored offices, completely unaware he was being observed. The timestamp in the corner of each screen showed current date and time. This wasn't archived footage. This was live surveillance happening right now. 3 separate phone lines sat on the desk, each labeled with cryptic codes rather than names. Next to them, a scanner cycled through radio frequencies, occasionally picking up fragments of law enforcement communications. Multiple computers hummed quietly, their screens displaying what looked like database searches and encrypted messaging systems. On the desk surface, scattered among the electronic equipment, were photographs, professional surveillance photos of people I recognized from news coverage and social events. Senators, judges, business leaders, journalists, all captured in compromising situations or private moments. Some were innocent enough, just candid shots of public figures in unguarded moments. Others made my stomach turn. I picked up one photo with trembling hands. It showed a federal judge I recognized from newspaper articles, sitting in what appeared to be a restaurant booth across from a woman who definitely wasn't his wife. The angle and quality suggested it had been taken with a powerful telephoto lens from a concealed position. Another photo showed a prominent senator's wife entering a medical clinic. The building's sign clearly visible in the background: of fertility treatment center. Personal information that could destroy careers and marriages if made public. My breath came in short gasps as I realized what I was looking at. This wasn't just surveillance, this was systematic intelligence gathering on the most powerful people in Washington. Richard wasn't just watching them. He was collecting ammunition against them. File folders were stacked neatly beside the photographs, each labeled with a person's name and what appeared to be a classification system. Some were marked with red tabs, others with green or yellow. I opened one at random and immediately wished I hadn't. The folder contained detailed financial records for a Supreme Court justice, showing patterns of expensive purchases that didn't match his reported income. Bank statements, credit card bills, property records, obtained through means I couldn't begin to imagine. At the bottom of the stack was a handwritten note in Richard's careful script: gambling debts, leverage confirmed. Activated 3/15. I dropped the folder as if it had burned me, papers scattering across the desk. This was blackmail. Systematic, organized, politically motivated blackmail on a scale that defied comprehension. More folders yielded. More horrors, affairs, financial improprieties, family secrets, medical conditions, every human vulnerability cataloged and weaponized. Richard had built a network of compromised officials spanning every branch of government and extending into media, business, and law enforcement. The computers were password protected, but the screens displayed enough information to make the scope clear: email accounts with hundreds of contacts, financial tracking software monitoring bank accounts that didn't belong to Richard, social media monitoring tools tracking the movements and associations of dozens of targets. I found myself hyperventilating, leaning against the desk for support. The man who asked about my grandchildren, who had helped pay for Emma's education, who treated me like family. He was orchestrating the corruption of American democracy from his basement. The elegant wine cellar above was just a front, a perfect cover for a space that should never have existed. Richard's sensitive political business wasn't legitimate. Congressional work kit was criminal conspiracy on a massive scale. I thought about Margaret's anxiety, her prescription bottles, the way she flinched at unexpected sounds. She had to know something was wrong, even if she didn't know the details. And the children: Sarah studying international relations with dreams of public service, Michael withdrawing from family life. They were growing up in a house built on systematic evil. One monitor caught my attention as the camera view changed, showing what was clearly a bedroom in someone's private residence. I watched in horror as the feed switched to a bathroom, then a kitchen, mapping out someone's most private spaces. This wasn't just professional surveillance, it was intimate violation. My phone buzzed with a text from Margaret, running late at book club. Could you start dinner prep early today? The normalcy of the message in this context felt surreal. Margaret was discussing book recommendations and lunch plans while her husband operated a blackmail empire beneath their feet. I responded with, shaking fingers, of course. See you later. I knew I should leave immediately, should flee this place and never look back. But I also knew that once I climbed those stairs, I would have to decide what to do with this knowledge. And that decision would affect not just Richard, but Margaret, Sarah, Michael. Innocent people caught in the web of his crimes. The surveillance monitors continued their silent vigil, recording the lives of unsuspecting targets. The hard drives spun with their digital secrets. The phone lines waited for their next corrupt transaction. And I stood in the middle of it all, a housekeeper who had stumbled into the dark heart of political power, holding the keys to either justice or my own destruction. The truth was even worse than I had feared, and I was only beginning to understand how deep it went. With the brass keys clutched in my trembling hand, I approached the first filing cabinet. Each drawer was meticulously labeled with letters of the alphabet, suggesting a comprehensive cataloging system that spanned hundreds, maybe thousands of individuals. I started with the drawer marked ASE, my hands shaking so badly I could barely fit the key into the lock. The mechanism turned smoothly, and I pulled open the drawer to reveal rows of manila folders, each tab bearing a name I recognized, from news coverage or political circles. The first folder I pulled was labeled Anderson, James Federal Judge, Ninth Circuit. Inside were dozens of photographs spanning what appeared to be several years. Judge Anderson at restaurants, entering hotels, meeting with people in parking garages. Financial records showed unexplained deposits into accounts linked to his wife. Phone transcripts revealed conversations about case decisions that hadn't been made public yet. At the front of the folder was a single, sheet-marked leverage assessment in Richard's handwriting. It detailed Anderson's gambling addiction, his mounting debts to questionable creditors, and his wife's expensive medical treatments for a condition she'd kept private. The final line made my blood run cold. Subject fully compromised. Voting record 100% compliance since activation. I grabbed another folder at random. Bradley, Patricia, Senate Judiciary Committee. The photos inside showed the senator in what was clearly a psychiatric facility, visiting someone I assumed was a family member. Medical records indicated her adult son had been institutionalized for violent tendencies, information that would destroy her carefully cultivated image as a family values politician. Richard's notes were clinical in their cruelty. Subject terrified of exposure affecting son's treatment options. Reliable vote on all judicial confirmations. Consider expanding pressure for additional committees. Folder after folder revealed the same pattern. Richard had identified the deepest vulnerabilities of dozens of powerful people and systematically exploited them. Affairs, addictions, financial crimes, family tragedies, medical conditions, nothing was too personal or sacred to weaponize. I found myself drawn to a thick folder near the back of the drawer labeled Insurance Policies Active. This manila folder was different from the others, marked with red tape and multiple security stickers. When I opened it, I understood why. Inside were the most damaging materials from Richard's entire collection. Photographs that would end careers instantly. Financial records proving corruption so blatant it would trigger criminal investigations. Personal documents that would destroy families and ruin lives. A DVD labeled Chief Justice Morrison Private. Meeting 3:20 seconds sat next to photographs of the nation's highest-ranking judge accepting what was clearly a substantial cash payment from an unidentified man in a parking garage. Another envelope contained medical records for a prominent senator's wife, showing treatment for a sexually transmitted disease that proved an affair, along with photos identifying her partner as a foreign diplomat. The insurance policies folder represented Richard's nuclear options. The material's so explosive that even the threat of exposure would guarantee absolute compliance. These weren't just leverage, they were weapons of mutually assured destruction. I turned to a cabinet marked operational files and found folders documenting Richard's methods, detailed surveillance schedules, contact information for private investigators, hackers, and what appeared to be professional blackmailers. Payment records showing hundreds of thousands of dollars, flowing to unnamed operatives. One folder contained floor plans and security assessments for government buildings, private residences, and corporate headquarters. Another held technical specifications for surveillance equipment and hacking tools. Richard hadn't just stumbled into this operation. He had built a sophisticated spider criminal enterprise with the precision of a military campaign. The scope was staggering. Names I recognized from every level of government filled folder after folder. Federal judges whose decisions shaped national policy. Senators who controlled committee assignments. Cabinet members with access to classified information. Media executives who determined what stories reached the public. Richard hadn't just corrupted individual officials, he had systematically compromised the entire system of American governance. I found myself sinking into the desk chair, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what I was discovering. Each folder represented lives destroyed, democracy subverted, justice perverted, and all of it orchestrated by the man who had shown such kindness to my family, who had made my daughter's education possible. The worst part was realizing how long this had been going on. Some of the files dated back over a decade, suggesting Richard had been building this network since early in his congressional career. The operation had grown from a few opportunistic blackmail schemes into a comprehensive system of control. A noise from upstairs, the front door closing, sent panic shooting through my system. I glanced at my phone. 11:30 a.m. Margaret wasn't supposed to be back from book club until after lunch. I quickly closed the folders and locked the filing cabinet, my heart racing as I tried to calculate how long it would take to reach the stairs and close the hidden door. Footsteps crossed the floor above, heading toward the kitchen. Margaret's voice called out, "Elenora, are you here?" "Coming." I called back, trying to keep my voice steady while I frantically replaced the keys on their hook and headed for the stairs as I climbed toward the false wall. Leaving that chamber of horrors behind, I carried with me the crushing weight of knowledge I never should have gained. Richard Whitmore wasn't just corrupt. He was the spider at the center of a web that had captured and poisoned the highest levels of American government, and somehow was going to have to figure out what to do about it. The manila folder labeled insurance policies remained burned into my memory, representing not just Richard's most powerful weapons, but potentially the key to bringing down his entire operation. If I could somehow get that evidence to the right people, it might be enough to stop him. But first, I had to survive long enough to try. I emerged from the wine cellar trying to appear calm, but my legs felt unsteady as I climbed the basement stairs. Margaret was in the kitchen, setting down her purse and looking unusually flustered. "Book club ended early," she explained, not quite meeting my eyes. "Sandra wasn't feeling well, so we postponed the discussion until next week." "I hope she's all right," I managed, hanging my cleaning apron on its usual hook and trying to keep my voice normal. "Would you like some tea?" "That would be lovely, thank you." As I prepared Margaret's green tea, my mind raced with what I'd just discovered. How could I stand in this kitchen making small talk about book clubs and Sandra's health, when I now knew that the foundation of this family's life was built on systematic crime? Margaret seemed distracted, checking her phone repeatedly and glancing toward the windows as if expecting someone. Her anxiety was more pronounced than usual, her hands shaking slightly as she accepted the delicate china cup. "Elenora," she said suddenly, "has Richard been working in the basement more than usual lately?" The question hit me like a physical blow. Did she know something? Had she suspected what was really happening beneath their feet? I don't really pay attention to his schedule," I lied, setting down the tea kettle with careful precision. "Why do you ask?" "Oh, nothing specific. I just hear him down there at odd hours sometimes. Late at night, early in the morning." She sipped her tea, but her eyes remained troubled. "I suppose congressmen never really stop working." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. If Margaret was hearing activity from the hidden office, she might know more than she was letting on. The thought terrified me. Was she complicit in Richard's crimes, or another victim of his manipulation? After Margaret retreated to her bedroom for her afternoon rest, I returned to the basement. I had to know if Richard had a file on me, on my family. The possibility that my hiring hadn't been coincidental, that I'd been selected as carefully as his political targets, gnawed at me. Back in the hidden office, I went straight to the filing cabinet containing names, starting with R. My hands shook as I searched through the folders, dreading what I might find. And there it was. Reed Elenora, household staff. The folder was thicker than I'd expected, filled with information that made my stomach turn. Photographs of me entering and leaving my apartment, taken with a telephoto lens. Copies of Emma's medical school transcripts and financial aid applications. Bank statements showing my credit card debt and the desperate months after my husband's death, when I'd struggled to pay basic bills. But it was the personal information that truly shattered me. Richard knew about Emma's scholarship interview, the one that had secured her spot at Johns Hopkins. He knew about my late husband's gambling debts that I'd kept secret from Emma. He knew about my mother's dementia diagnosis and the expensive care facility I was trying to avoid. A handwritten note in Richard's careful script detailed his assessment. Subject ideal for long-term placement. Financial vulnerability ensures loyalty. Daughter's education provides ongoing leverage. Family history suggests discretion and desperation. Recommend activation. There was a copy of my job application, but it wasn't the one I remembered filling out. This version had been annotated with notes about my psychological profile, my weaknesses, my pressure points. Richard hadn't just interviewed me for a housekeeping position, he had recruited me as an unknowing asset. Medical bills from Emma's childhood appendectomy were there, along with records of every payment I'd made on her student loans. He knew the exact amount of my monthly expenses, the balance in my savings account, the date my health insurance would expire if I lost my job. Most chilling of all was a series of photographs showing Emma at Johns Hopkins, walking to class, studying in the library, meeting with professors. The images were recent, some dated just last week. Richard was having my daughter surveilled, making sure I understood that her safety and future depended on my continued loyalty and silence. A receipt paperclip to the back of the folder made my knees buckle. It was from the medical equipment company that had provided the hospital bed for my husband during his final weeks. The bill had been marked paid in full with Richard's signature on the payment authorization. He had been watching me, evaluating me, manipulating me since before my husband's death. The job offer, the generous salary, the Christmas bonuses, the help with Emma's education had all been calculated to create exactly the kind of gratitude and dependence that would ensure my silence. If I ever discovered his secrets, I was never his trusted housekeeper. I was his insurance policy strategically placed to have intimate access to his home while being too compromised to ever pose a threat. The cruelest irony was that his assessment had been absolutely correct. I was trapped by the very kindness. He had shown me the financial security he had provided, the future he had made possible for Emma. How could I destroy the man who had saved my family from poverty and despair? But as I stared at those surveillance photos of my daughter, I realized that Richard's kindness had always come with strings attached. Emma's education, my job, our comfortable life, it all existed at his discretion, contingent on my cooperation and silence. I thought about Sarah and Michael upstairs, innocent children growing up in a house built on corruption. I thought about Margaret's anxiety and the fear I'd seen in her eyes. I thought about all the families Richard had destroyed with his blackmail schemes, the careers he had ended, the lives he had ruined. The receipt for my husband's medical equipment was more than just evidence of Richard's manipulation. It was proof that he had been planning this for years, waiting for the right moment to place the perfect asset in his home. I had been chosen, not for my cleaning skills or my reliability, but for my vulnerability and my desperation. And now that I knew the truth about what he was doing, I had to decide whether that vulnerability would continue to control me, or whether I could find the strength to fight back. The medical bills receipt crinkled in my shaking hand as I closed the folder and locked the cabinet. Richard Whitmore had saved my family, but he had also enslaved us. And somehow I was going to have to find a way to break those chains without destroying the innocent people caught in his web. That evening, after the family had retired to their rooms, I found myself back in the underground office. I couldn't sleep knowing what I now knew. Couldn't pretend that normal life could continue while carrying this burden. I needed to understand the full scope of Richard's crimes to see the human cost of his operations. I returned to the filing cabinets with grim determination. It's time looking specifically for evidence of what had happened to people who had refused Richard's demands or tried to expose him. What I found was a catalog of human destruction that made me physically ill. The files were organized with clinical precision. Resistance management folders documented Richard's methods for dealing with non-compliant targets. Termination protocols detailed how he had ended the careers and lives of those who posed threats to his operation. One folder that particularly caught my attention was labeled Whitman, Herald Federal Judge Deceased. Judge Whitman had been in the news 2 years ago when he committed suicide in his chambers, leaving behind a note apologizing for unspecified failures of judgment. The official story was that he had been struggling with depression and work stress. Richard's file told a different story. Photographs showed Judge Whitman meeting with his adult son, who had been arrested multiple times for drug possession, but never prosecuted. Bank records revealed that Whitman had been taking bribes to ensure his son's cases were dismissed or charges reduced. When Richard approached Whitman about controlling his judicial decisions, the judge had initially complied. But according to Richard's notes, Whitman had grown increasingly unstable, threatening to confess everything to the FBI and expose the entire operation. The final document in the folder was a photocopy of Judge Whitman's suicide note. Not the sanitized version that had been released to the media, but the original. In his own handwriting, Whitman had written, "I cannot live with what I have become. The corruption goes deeper than anyone knows. Richard Whitmore has destroyed more lives than mine. Someone must stop him," before the note ended mid-sentence. According to Richard's timeline, Whitman had been found dead 30 minutes after writing it. A paper-clipped annotation in Richard's handwriting read, "Problem resolved. Asset liquidated before security breach. Note edited before release to family media." My hands shook as I realized what I was reading. Richard hadn't just driven Judge Whitman to suicide, he had controlled the narrative afterward, editing the suicide note to remove any mention of his own crimes. A man had died trying to expose Richard's operation, and Richard had turned even that death into another tool for maintaining his power. I found more victims in subsequent folders. Senator Patricia Morse, whose affair had been exposed after she refused to vote the way Richard demanded, leading to her resignation and her husband's heart attack. Journalist David Chen, whose investigation into government corruption had been derailed when Richard leaked information about Chen's son's autism diagnosis, destroying the reporter's credibility and ending his career. Each file contained not just the primary target's information, but details about their families, their children, their elderly parents. Richard's leverage often came from threatening innocent family members who had no idea they were being used as weapons against their loved ones. The most heartbreaking folder belonged to Dr. Sarah Martinez, a CDC whistleblower who had tried to expose unsafe conditions at government facilities. Richard had targeted her teenage daughter, threatening to release intimate photos obtained through social media, hacking unless Martinez dropped her investigation. The photos themselves weren't in the file, but Martinez's desperate handwritten plea for mercy was, "Please, she's just a child. I'll do whatever you want. Just don't hurt my baby." According to Richard's notes, Martinez had withdrawn her complaint and taken early retirement. Her daughter had attempted suicide 6 months later. Though Richard's file didn't indicate whether the attempt was related to the blackmail or if Richard had followed through on his threats. The pattern was always the same: identify vulnerabilities, exploit them ruthlessly, and maintain control through ongoing terror. Richard didn't just destroy his primary targets, he devastated entire families, using love and protection as weapons against people who dared to oppose him. But it was the folder marked network maintenance that truly revealed the scope of his evil. This contained records of Richard's routine cleanings, periodic purges of his network when he identified potential security risks. The most recent entry, dated just 3 months ago, documented the destruction of a congressional aide, who had grown suspicious about her boss's sudden voting changes. Richard had leaked false information about her mental health to her employer, then arranged for planted evidence of prescription drug abuse to be found in her apartment. She had been fired, arrested, and was now facing federal charges for crimes Richard had fabricated. Her teenage son was in foster care. Her elderly mother had lost her home trying to pay for legal fees. An entire family destroyed because a dedicated public servant had asked too many questions. As I read file after file, I began to understand that Richard's operation wasn't just about political control, it was about maintaining a system where questioning authority became literally impossible. He had created a network of fear so comprehensive that even thinking about resistance carried devastating consequences. The suicide note copy from Judge Whitman sat before me like an accusation. Someone must stop him, the judge had written before his death. Someone must stop him. I thought about Emma, safe in her dorm room, pursuing her dream of becoming a doctor. I thought about Sarah and Michael upstairs, innocent children who deserved better than growing up in a house built on the bones of destroyed families. I thought about Margaret, trapped in a marriage to a monster she was too terrified to leave. Judge Whitman had tried to stop, rechart, and died for it. Dr. Martinez had tried to protect her daughter and lost everything. Dozens of good people had attempted to stand up to corruption and been systematically destroyed, but they had all been alone, facing Richard's machine without allies or protection. They hadn't known the full scope of his operation, hadn't understood how deep his network went. I was different. I was inside his house, with access to his files, with knowledge of his methods. I knew where all the bodies were buried because I was standing in the graveyard. The question was whether I could succeed where they had failed, or whether I would simply become another file in Richard's collection, another victim whose destruction served as a warning to anyone else who might dare to challenge him. Judge Whitman's suicide note seemed to stare at me from the folder, its unfinished sentence hanging in the air like a challenge. Someone must stop him before what? Before he destroyed more families, before he corrupted more officials, before he turned the entire government into his personal instrument of control. I carefully returned the files to their proper places and locked the cabinet. As I climbed the stairs back to the false normalcy of the wine cellar, I carried with me the weight of all those destroyed lives and the growing certainty that I couldn't let their sacrifices be meaningless. Richard Whitmore had to be stopped. And somehow, a 42-year-old housekeeper with a daughter in medical school was going to have to figure out how to do what federal judges and investigative journalists had died trying to accomplish. The next morning brought a new horror as I discovered the true scope of Richard's network. Hidden behind a false back panel in one of the filing cabinets was a hand-drawn organizational chart that mapped out the most comprehensive corruption scheme I could have imagined. The chart was Richard's masterpiece, a visual representation of his criminal empire drawn in his meticulous handwriting. At the center sat his own name, connected by lines to dozens of other names arranged in concentric circles. Each line was color-coded, red for full control, yellow for partial compromise, and green for underdevelopment. The red lines were the most disturbing. They connected Richard to 3 Supreme Court justices, 12 federal judges, 8 senators, and 2 cabinet members. These weren't just people Richard had dirt on. These were individuals completely under his control, their decisions and votes choreographed by his demands. Senator Patricia Williams, whom I'd seen on the news just last week advocating for judicial reform, was connected to Richard with a red line. Her annotation read, "Daughter's medical records, bipolar diagnosis, career destruction guaranteed if non-compliant." The bitter irony was that Williams was publicly fighting for the very integrity that Richard was privately destroying. Even more chilling were the connections to law enforcement. FBI Deputy Director Marcus Chen was linked with a red line and the notation, "Son's gambling debts to Russian contacts. Full cooperation assured." The man responsible for investigating federal crimes was himself compromised. explaining how Richard had operated for so long without detection. The network extended beyond government into media and business. Washington. Post editor Catherine Brooks was marked with Brothers tax evasion, $2.3 million unreported. CNN anchor James Morrison was tagged with affair with subordinate, multiple harassment complaints suppressed. These were the people responsible for informing the public about government corruption. Yet, they were part of the system enabling it. But it was the underdevelopment section that truly terrified me. Richard wasn't content with his current level of control. He was actively expanding his network. Names I recognized from recent confirmation hearings and upcoming elections were connected with green lines, indicating they were being researched and targeted for future compromise. A separate section of the chart showed Richard's operational support structure. Private investigators, computer hackers, photographers, and what appeared to be professional intimidators were all part of his payroll. Some were marked as contractors, others as assets, and a few carried the ominous designation permanent staff. One name in the contractor section made my blood freeze. Detective Ray Morrison, Metropolitan Police. The same Detective Morrison who had investigated Judge Whitman's suicide and declared it a straightforward case of depression-related self-harm. Richard owned the very people responsible for investigating crimes like his own. Cross-references showed how the network reinforced itself. When Senator Williams needed a vote on judicial reform killed, Richard would activate Judge Patterson to file an injunction. When FBI Director Chen needed to bury an investigation, he would coordinate with Deputy Director Chen. The system was self-protecting, with each compromised official unknowingly helping to protect the others. Financial flows were tracked with military precision. Richard had documented not just what leverage he held over each person, but exactly how much money their compliance was worth to him. Judicial decisions were valued in the millions. Regulatory approvals were worth even more. A single vote from a Supreme Court justice on a corporate case could generate tens of millions in profit for Richard's unknown clients, because that was the most disturbing revelation of all. Richard wasn't the top of this pyramid. The organizational chart showed connections flowing upward to entities labeled only as primary clients and international interests. Richard was operating on behalf of others, selling American democracy to the highest bidders. Phone numbers and meeting schedules suggested regular contact with representatives from foreign governments, multinational corporations, and criminal organizations that I couldn't even identify. Richard wasn't just corrupting American officials for his own benefit. He was doing it as a service provider for anyone willing to pay his prices. The scope was staggering. Richard had turned the United States government into a criminal enterprise that could be rented by hostile foreign powers, corrupt corporations, and organized crime syndicates. Every major policy decision, every judicial ruling, every law enforcement action was potentially compromised by his network. I found myself staring at the chart for over an hour, trying to comprehend how one man could have assembled such a comprehensive system of control. The answer lay in the timeline annotations scattered throughout the document. Richard had been building this network for over 15 years, starting small with local judges and gradually working his way up the power structure. Each successful compromise had provided information and access needed for the next target. A's cooperation gave Richard insight into which prosecutor was vulnerable to pressure. Prosecutor B's compliance provided access to police files that revealed Detective C's financial problems. It was a carefully orchestrated cascade of corruption that had ultimately reached the highest levels of government. What made it even more insidious was that many of the compromised officials probably didn't understand the full scope of what they were part of. A judge who occasionally ruled in favor of a certain corporation might not realize he was part of a vast criminal conspiracy. An FBI agent who buried a particular investigation might think he was just protecting his own secret, not enabling systematic treason. The organizational chart wasn't just a map of Richard's network. It was a blueprint for the complete subversion of American democracy. And according to the progress notes scattered throughout, the project was nearing completion. Recent annotations indicated that Resent was preparing for something he called Phase 3 implementation. Earlier phases had apparently involved network building and control establishment. Phase 3 appeared to involve full activation of the network for purposes that weren't clearly defined in the chart, but carried annotations like constitutional Allah. This is preparation and emergency powers transition. Whatever Richard was planning, it was bigger than individual blackmail schemes or isolated corruption. He was positioning his network for some kind of systematic takeover of government functions, using the compromised officials he controlled to fundamentally alter how the country was governed. As he carefully photographed the organizational chart, with my phone, my hands shaking with the magnitude of what I was documenting, I realized that Richard's operation was far more dangerous than I had initially understood. This wasn't just about political corruption or personal enrichment. This was about the complete capture and control of American democracy by hostile foreign interests. The chart represented not just Richard's criminal enterprise, but evidence of what amounted to a sophisticated attack on the United States itself. And somehow, I was the only person outside the network who knew it existed. The weight of that knowledge felt crushing as I returned the chart to its hiding place and locked the cabinet. I wasn't just dealing with a corrupt politician. I was facing a conspiracy that reached into every branch of government and extended to foreign enemies of the United States, and I was completely alone. I spent the next 2 days in a state of barely controlled panic, going through the motions of my daily routine while my mind raced with the impossible challenge of what to do with the information I discovered. Every time Richard smiled at me over breakfast or asked about Emma's studies, I felt like I was going to be sick. The worst part was maintaining normalcy, making coffee, preparing meals, cleaning rooms where Richard planned the destruction of American democracy while his children did homework and Margaret worried about ordinary things like Sarah's college applications and Michael's grades. On Thursday evening, while Richard was at a late committee meeting and the family was asleep, I made my decision. I couldn't go to the FBI. Richard owned people there. I couldn't trust local police. Detective Morrison was in his pocket. The media was compromised, and most government officials were either controlled or under surveillance. But I could document everything. I could create a record so comprehensive and damaging that even Richard's network couldn't suppress it all. If I could gather enough evidence and distribute it widely enough, some of it would have to reach people who could act on it. I returned to the underground office with a desperate plan. Using my phone, I would photograph every crucial document, every organizational chart, every piece of evidence that proved Richard's crimes. Then I would find a way to get that information to multiple sources simultaneously: journalists, law enforcement agencies, foreign allies, anyone who might be able to act on it. The work was tedious and terrifying. Every photograph had to be clear enough to read, every document positioned to capture maximum detail. I sorted through thousands of pages, selecting the most damaging evidence while constantly listening for any sound that might indicate Richard's early return. The burner phone I found in his desk drawer became my most important discovery. Unlike his regular phones, this device contained encrypted communications with his network of compromised officials and foreign contacts. The text messages and call logs were a real-time record of corruption in action. Recent messages showed Richard coordinating judicial decisions with Supreme Court Justice Morrison. Patterson ruling on corporate liability must favor defendants. Client concerns about damages ceiling. Morrison's response was immediate. Understood. Opinion draft will reflect necessary adjustments. Another exchange with FBI Deputy Director Chen was even more damaging. Investigation into defense contractor irregularities must be terminated immediately. Too close to Client B operations. Chun's reply will cite jurisdictional issues and transfer to compromised local office. The communications revealed that Richard's clients were indeed foreign entities and criminal organizations. Messages referenced payments from Moscow operations, Beijing interests, and cartel coordination. The United States government was literally being sold to its enemies, one decision at a time. I photographed screen after screen of these communications, building an archive that would be impossible to deny or dismiss. The burner phone was Richard's mistake. He had kept records of everything. probably for his own protection, not realizing that those same records could destroy him. Financial records on the device showed staggering amounts of money flowing through Richard's operation. Individual judicial decisions were worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. Regulatory changes generated millions. The suppression of criminal investigations commanded premium prices, especially when they involved international crimes. But the most shocking discovery was a series of messages about an upcoming operation labeled Constitutional Framework Modification. The communications were cryptic, but they clearly involved using Richard's network of compromised officials to create some kind of governmental crisis that would justify emergency powers and constitutional changes. Richard was planning to use his corrupted network to engineer a fundamental transformation of American democracy. It's probably in favor of his foreign clients. The timeline suggested this operation was planned for the coming months. It's coinciding with several major Supreme Court cases and congressional votes. I realized with growing horror that I wasn't just documenting past crimes, I was uncovering an ongoing plot against the United States itself. Richard's blackmail network wasn't just about corruption anymore. It was about treason on a scale that could destroy the country. As I worked through the night, photographing documents and copying files, I developed a distribution strategy. I would create multiple copies of the evidence and send them simultaneously to every potentially honest journalist, law enforcement official, and foreign ally I could identify. Even if Richard's network managed to suppress most of the releases, some would have to get through. I would also prepare a Deadman's switch-up system that would automatically release all the evidence if anything happened to me or my family. Richard's files had shown how he eliminated threats, but if he knew that my death would trigger massive exposure, he might hesitate to act against me. The evidence I was gathering wasn't just about Richard's crimes, it was about the systematic betrayal of American democracy by its most trusted officials. Supreme Court justices were taking orders from foreign governments. FBI leaders were protecting international criminals. Senators were voting according to the instructions of hostile foreign powers. By dawn, I had documented over 2,000 pages of evidence and copied hundreds of electronic communications. The scale of the corruption was so vast that no single news organization or law enforcement agency could handle it alone. It would require a coordinated response from multiple honest institutions working together. But as I prepared to leave the underground office, I realized the most dangerous part of my plan was yet to come. I had to figure out how to get this information to trustworthy recipients without alerting Richard's surveillance network. I had to protect Emma and myself while ensuring the evidence reached people who could act on it. And I had to do all of this while continuing to work in Richard's house, preparing his meals and cleaning his rooms, pretending that nothing had changed. While carrying the weight of his crimes and the responsibility for stopping him, the burner phone felt heavy in my hand as I returned it to its hiding place. It contained the evidence that could save American democracy, but it also represented the target that was now painted on my back. Richard would eventually discover that someone had accessed his files, and when he did, he would stop at nothing to eliminate the threat. I climbed the stairs back to the wine cellar with the knowledge that I had probably just signed my own death warrant, but I also carried with me the tools to bring down the most dangerous criminal conspiracy in American history. The question now was whether I could execute my plan before Richard discovered what I had done. Friday morning brought the closest call of my life. I had been so focused on documenting Richard's files that I hadn't paid careful attention to his schedule. While I was in the underground office copying the last of the financial records, I heard the unmistakable sound of the front door opening above. 3 hours earlier than Richard was supposed to return from his overnight trip to New York. Panic shot through my system like ice water. I was trapped in the basement with thousands of classified documents spread across Richard's desk, my phone full of incriminating photographs, and no legitimate explanation for being in a room that wasn't supposed to exist. I could hear Richard's footsteps crossing the floor above, moving toward the kitchen where he would expect to find me preparing his usual post-travel breakfast. In minutes, maybe seconds, he would start looking for me when I didn't respond to his calls, moving with desperate speed. I began returning documents to their proper files, my hands shaking so badly I could barely grip the papers. Every footstep above felt like a countdown to discovery. The organizational chart had to go back to its hidden compartment. The financial records had to be returned to their exact positions. The burner phone had to be placed precisely where I'd found it. Elenora, Richard's voice called from upstairs. Casual, but with an edge that made my blood freeze. "Are you here?" I shoved the last file into its cabinet and locked it, my fingers fumbling with the brass keys. "Coming, Congressman." I called back, hoping my voice sounded normal despite the terror constricting my throat. But as I turned toward the stairs, I realized I had made a fatal mistake. In my panic to clean up, I had left one of the most damaging documents of payment. Records showing money from Russian sources sitting on the desk. By the time I noticed it, Richard's footsteps were already heading toward the basement stairs. I grabbed the document and shoved it into my cleaning supplies bag, then rushed to the hidden door. The mechanism seemed to take forever to respond, precious seconds ticking by while Richard's steps grew closer. Finally, the wall swung shut just as I heard him reach the bottom of the basement stairs. I forced myself to walk calmly to the wine storage area, pulling out my dustcloth and beginning to clean bottlenecks as if I'd been working there all along. When Richard appeared around the corner, I looked up with what I hoped was a natural expression of mild surprise. "Oh, hello. You're back early. How was New York?" Richard's eyes swept the wine cellar, taking in every detail with the sharp attention that had made him such an effective politician. His gaze lingered on the area where the hidden door was concealed, and for a terrifying moment, I thought he might notice something out of place. "The meeting's finished ahead of schedule," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "I decided to drive back last night instead of staying over." His eyes found mine. "What are you working on down here?" "Just the monthly deep cleaning you requested," I managed, gesturing to the bottles I'd been dusting. "I like to do it when you're away so I don't disturb your evening routine." He nodded slowly, but something in his expression had changed. The warm familiarity I was used to had been replaced by a calculating coolness that sent chills down my spine. "You're very thorough, Elenora. I've always appreciated that about you." He moved closer, and I caught a whiff of his expensive cologne, mixed with something else: tension, suspicion, danger. "You take care of every detail, don't you?" "I try to do my job well," I said, focusing on keeping my voice steady while my heart hammered against my ribs. Richard picked up one of the bottles. I'd been cleaning a 1985 Burgundy worth several $1,000s, and examined it with apparent casualness. But his movements were too controlled, too deliberate. He was studying me as much as the wine. "I've been thinking about security lately," he said, still examining the bottle. "With everything that's happening in Washington, you can never be too careful about who you trust." His eyes met mine over the wine bottle. "People aren't always what they seem, are they?" The question hung in the air like a threat. Did he know? Had I left some trace of my presence in the hidden office? Was this casual conversation actually an interrogation? "Suppose not," I replied, trying to project the innocence I no longer felt. Though I've always found that treating people with trust and respect usually brings out the best in them. "Usually," Richard agreed, but his smile didn't reach his eyes. "Though sometimes people disappoint you. Sometimes they betray the very trust that's been placed in them." He set down the wine bottle with deliberate precision and moved toward the area where the hidden door was concealed. My breath caught in my throat as he ran his hand along the wall, his fingers tracing the nearly invisible seam I had discovered just days earlier. "This house has so many secrets," he said softly, his back still turned to me. "Old Georgetown mansions are full of hidden spaces, forgotten rooms, concealed passages. You never know what you might find if you go looking for it." I stood frozen, the cleaning cloth clutched in my white-knuckled hands, waiting for him to activate the mechanism that would reveal his secret office and my betrayal. But after a long moment, he turned away from the wall and faced me again. "Well, I should let you get back to your work," he said, his tone returning to something approaching normal. "I'll be in my study if you need anything. And Elenora." He paused at the foot of the stairs. "Very grateful for your loyalty over these years. I hope you know how much your discretion means to our family." The word discretion carried unmistakable weight, A reminder and a warning wrapped in apparent gratitude. I managed to nod and murmur something appropriate, but inside I was screaming. After Richard's footsteps faded upstairs, I remained in the wine cellar for another 20 minutes, my legs too shaky to trust. Had I imagined the menace in his words, or had he been sending me a message? Did he suspect what I discovered? Or was I projecting my own guilt onto his innocent questions? When I finally made it back to the kitchen, found a security camera footage disc sitting on the counter, something I'd never seen before. There was no note, no explanation, just the disc sitting where I couldn't miss it. With trembling hands, I loaded it into the DVD player in the living room. The footage showed the wine cellar from an angle I hadn't noticed, a hidden camera that had been recording everything. But the timestamp showed only the past hour, Richard's visit to the basement and my innocent cleaning routine. Either the camera had been installed recently, or Richard had only started recording after he became suspicious. Either way, it was a clear message. I was being watched now, my every movement monitored and recorded as I ejected the disc and returned it to the kitchen counter. I realized that my window for gathering evidence had probably closed. Richard might not know exactly what I discovered, but he clearly suspected something. From now on, every action would be scrutinized, every movement tracked. The security camera footage served as both a warning and a countdown timer. Richard was closing in, and I was running out of time to execute my plan before he realized the full extent of what I knew. The close call had shaken me badly, but it had also clarified something important. Richard wasn't just corrupt, he was dangerous, in ways I was only beginning to understand. And now that I was on his radar, I was living on borrowed time. The tension in the house became unbearable over the weekend. Richard watched me constantly now, his eyes following my movements with an intensity that made my skin crawl. But it was during Sunday dinner that the family's carefully maintained facade finally began to crack. Sarah had received her early admission letter from Georgetown's School of Foreign Service. That afternoon, the same program her father had graduated from decades earlier. She should have been ecstatic, but instead she sat at the dinner table picking at her food, the acceptance letter lying unopened beside her plate. "Aren't you going to read it?" Margaret asked, her voice strained with the effort of maintaining normalcy. "You've been waiting for this moment for months." "I know what it says," Sarah replied quietly, not looking up from her untouched roast beef. "I know because Dad made sure I'd get in, just like he makes sure of everything else in this family." Richard's fork paused halfway to his mouth. "Sarah, that's unfair. You earned this acceptance through your own hard work and merit." "T.I." Sarah's voice was sharp with teenage anger and adult disillusionment. "Or did one of your friends on the admissions board make sure the right decision got made? Just like Judge Patterson suddenly started ruling in favor of your clients? Just like that journalist stopped investigating your campaign finances?" Silence that followed was deafening. Michael stopped eating entirely, his eyes darting between his parents and sister with obvious fear. Margaret's face had gone pale, her hands trembling as she reached for her wineglass. "Sarah Elizabeth Whitmore." Richard's voice carried a warning that made even me flinch. "You have no idea what you're talking about, don't I?" Sarah stood up, abruptly, the acceptance letter fluttering to the floor. "I'm not stupid, Dad. I see the meetings, I hear the phone calls. Hi, I watch the news and see how people who cross you suddenly have problems. What did you do to get me into Georgetown? Whose life did you destroy this time? That's enough." Richard slammed his hand on the table, making the china jump. "You're being dramatic and ungrateful. Everything I do is for this family, to protect our future and give you opportunities. Opportunities built on what?" Sarah's voice cracked with emotion. "How many people have you hurt to give me this opportunity? How many families have you destroyed so we can live in this house and pretend everything is perfect?" Margaret finally found her voice, though it came out as barely a whisper. "Sarah, please sit down. This isn't appropriate dinner conversation." "When is it appropriate, Mom?" Sarah turned to her mother with tears in her eyes. "When is it appropriate to talk about the fact that our father is what?" Richard roared, standing so quickly his chair toppled backward. "What exactly do you think I am, Sarah? The room fell silent except for the sound of Michael's quiet sobbing. The 14-year-old had finally reached his breaking point. Years of tension and fear spilling out in helpless tears. Sarah looked at her father with a mixture of love and revulsion that broke my heart. "I think you're a man who's forgotten the difference between right and wrong. I think you've become someone who hurts people for power, and you've convinced yourself it's all for us so you don't have to feel guilty about it." Richard's face cycled through rage, denial, and something that might have been shame before settling into cold calculation. "You don't understand the world, Sarah. You don't understand what it takes to survive in Washington, to protect a family, to ensure that good people can do good work without being destroyed by their enemies. But we're not good people anymore, are we?" Sarah's voice was small now, heartbroken. "We're the people other families need protection from." Margaret stood up slowly, her movements careful and deliberate, like someone walking through a minefield. "I think we should all take some time to cool down. Sarah, go to your room. Michael, you too." "No," Sarah said firmly. "I'm 18 in 3 months. I'm old enough to know the truth about what kind of man my father is and what kind of family we really are." She looked directly at Richard, her young face aged by understanding she shouldn't have had to gain. "I won't go to Georgetown, Dad. I won't take anything else that was bought with someone else's pain. I'd rather work my way through community college than benefit from whatever you've done." Richard's mask finally slipped completely. "You'll do exactly what I tell you to do, young lady. You'll go to Georgetown, you'll study international relations, and you'll be grateful for the opportunities that have been provided for you. The alternative is what?" Sarah challenged "You'll destroy my life like you destroy everyone else's. You'll threaten me like you've threatened your political enemies. I'm your daughter, Dad. If you can't love me without controlling me, then you don't really love me at all." Margaret burst into tears, her careful composure finally cracking under the weight of years of suppressed fear and guilt. Michael ran from the table, his sobs echoing from the stairs as he fled to his room. Sarah stood there for a moment longer, looking at her father with profound sadness. "I used to be so proud to be your daughter. I used to tell people that my dad was going to change the world." She picked up the Georgetown acceptance letter from the floor. "Now I'm ashamed to share your name." She walked out of the dining room with dignity beyond her years, leaving Richard and Margaret staring at each other across a table full of untouched food and broken dreams. Richard sank back into his chair, suddenly looking older than his 53 years. Margaret continued crying silently, her tears falling into her wineglass. "How did she?" Richard began, then stopped, his eyes finding mine across the room. For a moment, thought he was going to accuse me of telling Sarah about his crimes. But instead, he just stared at me with an expression I couldn't read, part suspicion, part desperation, part something that might have been recognition that his perfect world was crumbling around him. 20 years, Margaret whispered, her voice barely audible. 20 years I've been making excuses and looking the other way and telling myself it was for the children. And now my daughter looks at me like I'm a stranger." Richard reached across the table for his wife's hand, but she pulled away from his touch. "Margaret, everything I've done." "I know what you've done, Richard," she said quietly, her tears finally stopping. "I've always known. I just told myself that if I didn't ask questions, if I didn't look too closely, if I focused on being a good mother and a good wife, then somehow I wouldn't be responsible for any of it." She looked up at him with eyes that held 2 decades of suppressed knowledge and pain. "But I am responsible, aren't I? Every time I stayed silent, every time I spent money I knew came from hurting people, every time I smiled for the cameras, while knowing what you really why became part of it." The Georgetown acceptance letter lay on the floor between them, a symbol of dreams built on corruption and innocence destroyed by truth. Sarah's rejection of her father's tainted gift represented something Richard couldn't buy, threaten, or manipulate the moral clarity of someone who refused to be complicit in evil. As I cleared the table of untouched food and broken family traditions, I realized that the carefully constructed world Richard had built was already collapsing from within. His daughter's courage in rejecting his corrupted gifts had exposed the moral bankruptcy at the heart of their lives. The question now was whether that collapse would come fast enough to save them all, or whether Richard would do whatever it took to maintain control over his disintegrating empire van if it meant destroying his own family to protect his secrets. The next morning, Margaret appeared in the kitchen before dawn, still in her robe, clutching a cup of tea with hands that shook slightly. Her eyes were red-rimmed from crying, and she looked like she had aged years overnight. "Elenora," she said, quietly, not quite meeting my eyes. "Could we talk privately?" My heart raced, but I nodded and followed her to the sunroom at the back of the house, the one room where Richard had never installed his surveillance equipment, probably because he viewed it as Margaret's feminine domain. She closed the door carefully behind us and turned to face me with an expression of desperate resolve. "How long have you known?" The question hit me like a physical blow. I stood there speechless, my mind racing through possible responses. But Margaret continued. "Before I could form an answer, I saw you watching him during dinner last night. I saw the way you looked at Sarah when she was talking about what Richard has done. You know, don't you? You know what he really is." I sank into one of the wicker chairs, my legs suddenly unable to support me. "Margaret, please," she interrupted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Please don't lie to me. I can't bear any more lies." She moved to a small cabinet I'd always assumed held gardening supplies and pulled out a shoebox. Inside were dozens of prescription bottles, far more than the anxiety medication I'd seen in her bathroom. Antidepressants, sleep aids, anti-anxiety medications, even some medications I didn't recognize. "This is what 20 years of marriage to Richard Whitmore looks like," Shui said, setting the box on the glass table between us. "This is what it costs to be the wife of a monster and pretend. You don't know what he is." She sat down across from me, her movements careful and deliberate, like someone walking through pain. "I've known for almost 15 years, Elenora. Not the details, not the scope of it, but I've known he was corrupt. I've known he was hurting people." The confession hung between us like a bridge I wasn't sure I should cross. But Margaret's eyes held such desperate need for honesty, for a connection with another person who understood the truth, that I found myself nodding. "I found something," I admitted, "in the basement." "I wasn't snooping. It was an accident, but the hidden office," Margaret said quietly, "with all the files and computers and surveillance equipment." My shock must have been obvious because she gave me a sad smile. "You think I don't know about the room under our house where my husband orchestrates the destruction of American democracy? You think I don't hear the ventilation systems running at night? Don't notice when he disappears for hours into a basement that's supposed to only contain a wine cellar?" She reached for one of the prescription bottles, holding it up to the morning light streaming through the windows. "Alprazolam for anxiety. Do you know what causes anxiety, Elenora? Living with a man who has the power to destroy anyone who threatens him, including his own family. Regret. Why haven't you left him, turned him in, taken the children, and run?" She laughed bitterly. "With what money to wear? Do you think Richard doesn't monitor every dollar I spend, every phone call I make, every person I talk to? Do you think he doesn't have files on my family, my friends, everyone I care about?" She opened the medication bottle and shook a pill into her palm, staring at it like it held answers to questions she'd been afraid to ask. "The first time I discovered one of his schemes, Sarah was 8 and Michael was 6. I threatened to leave, to expose him, to take the children somewhere safe." Margaret's voice became so quiet, I had to lean forward to hear her. The next day, my mother, who lived in Denver and had never had so much as a speeding ticket, was arrested for tax evasion. Suddenly, the IRS found discrepancies in her returns going back 7 years. Her house was seized, her bank accounts frozen, her reputation destroyed. She dry swallowed the anxiety pill and continued. "It took me 3 months and $50,000 in legal fees to get the charges dropped. My mother never recovered from the stress. She had her first stroke 2 weeks after the case was resolved. The casual cruelty of it took my breath. A way Richard had used an elderly woman's minor tax mistakes to terrorize his own wife into compliance. That's when I understood what I was really married to." Margaret continued. "Not just a corrupt politician, but someone who would destroy innocent people, including my mother, to maintain control over me. And I had 2 young children who depended on me to protect them." She pulled out another prescription bottle, trazodone, for sleep. Because when you know your husband is capable of destroying anyone who threatens him, you tend to lie awake at night wondering if you or your children might someday become threats. Margaret stood and moved to the window, looking out at the perfectly manicured garden that Richard paid others to maintain. I convinced myself that staying silent was protecting Sarah and Michael, that as long as I didn't ask questions, didn't look too closely, didn't challenge him directly, they would be safe. But they're not safe, are they? I said quietly. No. Her voice broke slightly. Last night proved that. Sarah sees what he is, and she has the courage I never had to refuse his corrupted gifts. But that makes her dangerous to him, doesn't it? How long before he decides she needs to be controlled like everyone else in his life? Margaret turned back to me, and I saw in her eyes the same desperate determination I'd felt when I first discovered Richard's secret office. You found evidence, didn't you? Real evidence that could stop him? I nodded slowly. Yes. But Margaret, he suspects I know something. He's watching me now. If I try to expose him, he'll destroy you like he's destroyed everyone else who's tried. She sat back down, her movements more purposeful now. But what if you weren't alone? What if you had help from someone who knows his methods, his weaknesses, his routines? The offer hung between us, loaded with implications I was afraid to examine too closely. Margaret was proposing to betray her husband of 20 years to risk everything to help me expose the father of her children. Why? I asked. After all this time, after everything you've sacrificed to keep the peace, why now? Margaret picked up another prescription bottle. This one labeled with a medication I didn't recognize. Naltrexone, for addiction. She met my eyes with painful honesty. Not alcohol or drugs, Elenora. Addiction to the fantasy that I could protect my children by enabling their father's crimes. She stood up and walked to a small desk in the corner, pulling out a handwritten letter. Sarah wrote this to me last night. She's planning to emancipate herself when she turns 18. It's too legally separate from our family, so she won't be associated with Richard's crimes. The letter was brief but devastating. I can't be your daughter and remain a good person. I won't let Dad's corruption destroy my soul the way it's destroyed yours. I love you, but I have to save myself. Margaret folded the letter carefully and returned it to the desk. My daughter would rather be an orphan than be Richard's child. That's what my silence has cost me, the respect and love of my own children. She turned back to me with steel in her voice I'd never heard before. I can't save my marriage, and I probably can't save myself. But maybe I can help save Sarah and Michael from becoming the next generation of victims in Richard's empire. The prescription bottle sat on the table between us, like evidence of lives destroyed by willful blindness and enforced complicity. But Margaret's offer to help represented something else, the possibility that, even after 20 years of silence, it wasn't too late to choose courage over comfort. What are you proposing? I asked. Margaret's smile was sad but determined. Proposing that we stop being victims and start being the people who finally bring Richard Whitmore to justice. The medication bottles served as a stark reminder of the psychological toll Richard's crimes had taken on his own family. They also represented Margaret's decision to stop medicating her conscience and start acting on it. The confrontation came sooner than I expected. That same afternoon, while Margaret was taking Sarah to her college counselor and Michael was at school, Richard called me into his study. His usual warm demeanor had been replaced by something cold, and calculating that made my skin crawl. "Please sit down, Elenora," he said, gesturing to the chair across from his mahogany desk. "We need to have a conversation." The study felt different now that I knew what lay beneath it. The floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, the prestigious awards on the walls, the photographs with presidents and world leaders, it all felt like elaborate stagecraft designed to hide the monster. Underneath, Richard opened a manila folder on his desk and pulled out a series of photographs. My heart stopped as I recognized them. They were surveillance photos of me entering and leaving the hidden basement office. The timestamps showed my visits over the past week, documented with the precision of a criminal investigation. "I've been thinking about loyalty lately," Richard said conversationally, arranging the photos so I could see them clearly. About trust and gratitude and the importance of discretion in sensitive relationships. He pulled out another photograph. This one showing Emma walking across the Johns Hopkins campus, completely unaware she was being watched. Your daughter is doing well in her studies, I hear. Pediatric rotation this semester. Such a demanding field. Medicine. So many ways a promising career can be derailed by unfortunate circumstances. The threat was unmistakable, and my blood turned to ice. Richard, I don't know what you think, please, he interrupted, holding up a hand. Let's not insult each other with denials. You've been in my private office. You've seen files you have no business seeing. You've photographed documents with your phone. He tapped one of the surveillance photos. The question isn't whether you've betrayed my trust, it's what we're going to do about it. He leaned back in his leather chair, studying me with the same calculating gaze I'd seen him use on political opponents during televised hearings. I know you think you're doing the right thing, Elenora. I know you believe you've discovered evidence of wrongdoing that needs to be exposed. But you don't understand the complexity of the situation. Richard stood and walked to the window, overlooking the garden where Margaret grew her roses. Everything I do, every decision I make, every alliance I forgets, all in service of protecting this country from forces that would destroy it. The methods might seem harsh to someone outside the intelligence community, but they're necessary. Intelligence. Community, I managed to say, though my voice came out as barely a whisper. Did you think this was just personal corruption? Richard turned back to me with something that might have been amusement. Did you imagine I was blackmailing Supreme Court justices for my own enrichment? Elenora, I work for people who make decisions about national security at levels you can't even comprehend. He returned to his desk and pulled out a document. I recognized a page from the organizational chart, showing his connections to foreign interests. These foreign contacts you photographed, they're assets in a complex operation designed to protect American interests abroad. The blackmail you think you discovered? It's intelligence gathering that prevents wars and saves American lives. Richard sat down and leaned forward, his voice taking on the persuasive tone that had made him such an effective politician. I know how it must look from the outside. I know the files seem damning, but you're seeing individual trees without understanding the forest, Elenora. You're looking at tactics without comprehending the strategy. He pulled out one more photograph, this one showing Margaret and me talking in the sunroom that morning. I know my wife has been sharing her concerns with you. Margaret has always been too emotional, too quick to see malice where there's only necessity. She doesn't understand that sometimes protecting the people you love requires making difficult choices. The surveillance of our private conversation proved that nowhere in this house was truly safe from Richard's watching eyes. He knew about Margaret's decision to help me, knew about our alliance before we'd even had time to act on it. Here's what's going to happen, Richard continued, his voice hardening. You're going to delete every photograph you took from your phone. You're going to forget everything you think you saw in that basement office. And you're going to continue working for this family with the same loyalty and discretion you've shown for the past 3 years. He opened another folder and pulled out what looked like a contract. In exchange, Emma's medical school tuition will be fully covered through graduation. You'll receive a 50% salary increase and a generous retirement package when you choose to leave our employment. The offer was staggering, more money than I'd ever dreamed of. Emma's future secured. Financial worries eliminated forever. All I had to do was pretend I'd never discovered the truth about Richard's crimes. And if I refuse, I asked, though I already knew the answer. Richard's expression didn't change, but something cold flickered in his eyes. Then you'll discover how quickly a promising medical student can find herself facing charges for prescription drug abuse. How easily a hard-working housekeeper can be found with stolen goods in her possession. Oh, how devastating it can be when tax authorities decide to conduct a thorough audit of someone living beyond their apparent means. He pulled out a final photograph of his apartment, building, and set it on the desk between us. I want to be clear, Elenora. I like you. I respect you. I've considered you part of our family for 3 years, but I will not allow misguided moral posturing to threaten the safety and security of everything I've worked to build. The anonymous letter sitting on top of the contract made my stomach turn. It was addressed to the Johns Hopkins administration, alleging that Emma had been selling prescription medications to other students. The letter was detailed, convincing, and completely fabricated, but it would be enough to destroy her career before it began. You have until tomorrow morning to decide, Richard said, standing up to signal the end of our meeting. Delete the photographs, sign the contract, and continue being the loyal employee I know you can be. Or watch everything you and Emma have worked for disappear overnight. As I stood on shaky legs, Richard's voice followed me to the door. Oh, and Elenora. I wouldn't discuss this conversation with Margaret. She's been under a great deal of stress lately, and I'd hate for her to do something that might force me to take more drastic measures to protect our family's privacy. I left his study knowing that I had walked into a trap that had been years in the making. Richard hadn't just recruited me as a housekeeper, he had positioned me as a perfectly controlled asset, someone whose love for her daughter could be weaponized to ensure silence and compliance. The anonymous letter felt heavy in my hands as I climbed the stairs to my small apartment above the garage. Richard's ultimatum was crystal clear: become his willing accomplice or watch came destroy everything I cared about. But as I sat in my kitchen, staring at the fabricated accusations against Emma, I realized something that Richard might not have considered. He had made his threats so explicit, his methods so clear, that he had given me exactly the evidence I needed to prove his criminal intent. The letter threatening Emma wasn't just blackmail, it was a confession. And Richard Whitmore had just made his biggest mistake by putting his crimes in writing, right, and handing them directly to his victim. The question now was whether I could find a way to use that evidence before he realized what he had done. That night, alone in my apartment above the garage, I made the most important decision of my life. Richard's anonymous letter sat on my kitchen table like a smoking gun, and I finally understood what I had to do. He had made a fatal error in his desperation to control me. By putting his threats in writing, by documenting his methods so explicitly, he had provided me with the one thing I needed most: irrefutable proof of his criminal intent that even his compromised network couldn't dismiss or suppress. I pulled out my laptop and began to craft the most important document I would ever write. Using everything I had learned about Richard's operation, I compiled a comprehensive report that would serve as both an insurance policy and a roadmap for any honest investigator who received it. The report detailed Richard's blackmail network, his foreign connections, his methods of intimidation, and his systematic corruption of government officials. But more importantly, it included the anonymous letter threatening Emma and photographs of Richard's surveillance equipment, proving that he was actively monitoring and threatening private citizens. I copied every photograph I had taken in the basement office onto a secure USB drive, organizing them by category: financial crimes, blackmail materials, surveillance evidence, and foreign intelligence operations. The drive contained over 2,000 pages of documentation that painted a complete picture of the most comprehensive criminal conspiracy in American political history. But I knew that simply releasing the evidence wouldn't be enough. Richard's network included people in the FBI, the media, and law enforcement who would work to suppress or discredit anything I revealed. I needed a distribution strategy that would make suppression impossible. I spent hours researching journalists, investigators, and foreign intelligence services that might be trustworthy and beyond Richard's reach. I identified reporters in Canada, the UK, and Germany who had previously exposed international corruption cases. I found contact information for FBI field offices in cities where Richard's organizational chart showed no compromised officials. Most importantly, I located the contact information for Marcus Webb, a former CIA analyst who had been exposing government corruption through an encrypted blog that had somehow evaded Richard's network. Webb had been investigating patterns of foreign influence in American politics for years, and his work suggested he already suspected something like Richard's operation existed. I created multiple copies of the evidence package, each tailored to its intended recipient. The version for foreign journalists emphasized the national security implications and Richard's connections to hostile foreign governments. The package for law enforcement focused on specific criminal violations and provided detailed evidence for potential prosecutions. The version for Marcus Webb was the most comprehensive, including everything I had discovered, plus my personal account of how Richard had recruited and controlled me. I trusted that someone who had dedicated his career to exposing corruption would know how to verify and act on the information safely. Each package was encrypted and uploaded to secure file sharing services that required verification from the recipient before download. I scheduled the uploads to occur automatically at different times over the next 72 hours, ensuring that even if Richard discovered my plan and tried to stop me, the evidence would still reach its intended targets. But my most important preparation was the deadman switch I had learned about from thriller novels and spy movies. I created an automated system that would release all the evidence to multiple news organizations and law enforcement agencies simultaneously if I failed to enter a security code every 24 hours. The system was crude but effective. If Richard decided to eliminate the threat I posed by eliminating me, he would trigger the very exposure he was trying to prevent. My death or disappearance would become the signal that released everything I had discovered to the world. I also prepared a separate package specifically for Emma, explaining everything that had happened and why I had been forced to take such drastic action. The letter would be delivered to her automatically if something happened to me, along with enough evidence to protect her from any retaliation Richard might attempt. By dawn, I had created the most comprehensive documentation of political corruption in American history, distributed it through channels that would make suppression impossible, and protected myself and Emma through systems that would ensure justice even if we didn't survive to see it. The USB drive in my hand contained copies of everything, but the original files were now beyond Richard's reach, scattered across multiple secure servers and scheduled for automatic release to investigators around the world. I had kept Richard's anonymous letter threatening Emma as my final trump card. Unlike the other evidence, which could potentially be dismissed as misunderstood intelligence operations or taken out of context, the letter was a straightforward confession of criminal intent written in Richard's own hand. Any honest investigator who saw that letter would understand immediately that Richard Whitmore was not a patriotic intelligence officer, but a criminal who threatened innocent families to maintain his power. The letter was my insurance policy, my proof that whatever Richard claimed about his motives, he was ultimately just a predator who used fear to control his victims. As I prepared for what I knew would be my final day working in the Whitmore house, I felt a strange sense of peace. For 3 years, I had unknowingly been part of Richard's machine, my gratitude and dependence making me complicit in his crimes. But today, I would finally be free of that burden. I had transformed from victim to witness to active resistance fighter. The evidence I had gathered and distributed would either bring down Richard's network or, if I had failed, at least provide a roadmap for the next person brave enough to try. The USB drive felt surprisingly light in my pocket as I walked across the driveway to begin my last day of work for Congressman Richard Whitmore. I carried with me the power to destroy the most dangerous criminal in American politics, and the knowledge that whatever happened next, I had finally chosen courage over comfort. Richard thought he controlled me through my love for Emma and my gratitude for his help. He had no idea that those same emotions had given me the strength to risk everything to stop him. The evidence was secure. The systems were in place, and the countdown to justice had begun. All that remained was to see whether Richard would make the choice that would trigger his own destruction, or whether he would somehow find a way to survive the reckoning that was coming for him. Either way, his reign of terror was about to end. The end came faster than I expected. At 6:47 a.m. on a crisp Thursday morning, exactly 72 hours after I had uploaded the final evidence package, FBI agents surrounded the Whitmore house with a warrant that would change American politics forever. I was in the kitchen preparing Richard's morning coffee when I heard the vehicles pulling into the driveway. Through the window, I watched as black SUVs blocked every exit while agents in tactical gear took positions around the property. The lead agent, a woman in her 40s with steel gray hair, approached the front door with a document folder that I knew contained Richard's political death warrant. Richard peered in the kitchen doorway in his robe, his face cycling through confusion, anger, and calculation as he processed what was happening. For a moment, he looked at me with something that might have been admiration. "You really did it," he said quietly. "You actually found a way to outmaneuver me." Margaret came, Down the stairs was Sarah and Michael behind her, all of them drawn by the commotion outside. The children looked terrified, but Margaret's face showed something I hadn't seen in years: relief. The doorbell rang with the authority of federal law enforcement, followed immediately by loud knocking. "FBI, open the door. We have a warrant." Richard straightened his shoulders and walked to the front door with the dignity of a man who had always known this moment might come. When he opened it, Agent Patricia Morrison, no relation to the compromised officials in his network, stepped forward with the warrant. "Congressman Richard Whitmore, you are under arrest for conspiracy, extortion, bribery of federal officials, and violations of the Foreign Agents Registration Act." She began reading his rights while other agents flooded into the house. The raid was methodical and overwhelming. Teams of agents went directly to the basement, their knowledge of the hidden office's location proving that my evidence packages had reached the right people. Others secured computers, phones, filing cabinets throughout the house. Agent Morrison approached me while Richard was being handcuffed in the foyer. "Ms. Reed, I'm Agent Morrison, FBI Public Corruption Unit. We received your evidence packages and corroborating information from multiple international law enforcement agencies. Your documentation made this operation possible. The validation felt surreal after months of fear and uncertainty. Is my daughter safe?" "Completely protected. We have agents stationed at Johns Hopkins, and all threats against her have been neutralized." Agent Morrison's expression softened slightly. "What you did took extraordinary courage, Ms. Reed. You may have saved American democracy." As Richard was led away in handcuffs, he stopped in front of me one last time. The mask had finally come off completely, revealing neither the charming politician nor the cold manipulator, but simply a tired man who had lost everything. "Take care of them," he said, nodding toward Margaret and the children. "Whatever else I am, they're innocent." It was the first genuinely human thing I had heard him say in weeks. The next several hours blurred together as the scope of the operation became clear. The FBI had coordinated with international law enforcement agencies to simultaneously arrest Richard's network of co-conspirators across multiple countries. Supreme Court Justice Morrison was taken into custody at his chambers. Senator Williams was arrested at her campaign headquarters. FBI Deputy Director Chen was removed from his office in handcuffs. The evidence I had gathered, combined with intelligence from foreign allies who had been tracking Richard's international connections, triggered the largest corruption investigation in American history. Over 40 government officials were arrested in the first wave, with more arrests expected as investigators worked through the massive paper trail Richard had unknowingly preserved. Margaret handled the chaos with surprising strength. While FBI agents searched the house and reporters gathered outside, she sat with Sarah and Michael, explaining as gently as possible that their father had done terrible things that required him to face justice. "I should have protected you from this years ago," she told them, tears streaming down her face. "I was so afraid of what would happen if I spoke up that I forgot my responsibility to do what was right." Mature beyond her 18 years, took her mother's hand. "You're speaking up now, Mom. That's what matters." The hidden basement office became the center of an evidence operation that lasted for days. FBI computer specialists worked around the clock to decrypt Richard's files and trace his financial networks. The scope of the conspiracy expanded with each discovery: foreign intelligence services, international criminal organizations, and corrupt officials in dozens of countries. Marcus Webb, former CIA analyst whose blog had helped expose the conspiracy, published a comprehensive analysis of Richard's network that became the definitive account of the scandal. His work, combined with my first-hand testimony, painted a complete picture of how a single corrupt congressman had nearly succeeded in selling American democracy to the highest bidders. The organizational chart I had photographed became the prosecution's roadmap for additional arrests and investigations. Each red line connecting Richard to compromised official led to new charges and new revelations about the scope of the conspiracy. But perhaps the most important evidence was the anonymous letter Richard had given me threatening Emma. That single, Document written in his own hand proved criminal intent so clearly that even his expensive lawyers couldn't dispute it. The letter became the centerpiece of the prosecution's case, demonstrating that Richard's claims of patriotic service were lies designed to cover systematic criminal behavior. The media coverage was overwhelming. My story, a housekeeper who stumbled upon the crime of the century and risked everything to expose it, captured international attention. But I tried to stay focused on what mattered, ensuring that justice was served and that the victims of Richard's crimes finally received recognition for their suffering. Judge Whitman's family learned the truth about his suicide and launched a wrongful death lawsuit that would expose even more details about Richard's methods. Dr. Martinez's daughter, now in college, publicly thanked me for giving her family justice they never thought they would see. The investigation revealed that Richard's operation had been funded by a combination of foreign intelligence services and international criminal organizations seeking to influence American policy. The conspiracy had generated hundreds of millions of dollars while systematically corrupting the foundations of American government. Within 6 months, Richard pled guilty to multiple federal pre-law charges in exchange for cooperation with ongoing investigations. His testimony led to additional arrests and helped law enforcement agencies around the world dismantle similar corruption networks. The FBI raid warrant that had started it all was framed and hung in Agent Morrison's office, representing one of the most successful public corruption investigations in FBI history. But for me, it represented something simpler. The moment when courage finally triumphed over fear, and truth finally overcame the power of lies. 6 months after the FBI raid, I sat in my new apartment in Baltimore, opening a letter that would bring tears to my eyes and remind me why everything I had risked had been worth it. The envelope was addressed in careful handwriting to Ms. Elenora Reed, American hero, though the Postal Service had somehow managed to deliver it to my correct address. Inside was a handwritten note from Dr. Sarah Martinez, the CDC whistleblower whose daughter had nearly been destroyed by Richard's blackmail scheme. Dear Ms. Reed, the letter began, I hope this finds you well and at peace. I wanted you to know that my daughter graduated from college last month with highest honors. She's planning to study law now, inspired by your courage to fight for justice even when it seemed impossible. You gave our family back our future, and we will never forget that gift. I set the letter on my kitchen table next to dozens of others' thank you notes from victims. Lives had been destroyed by Richard's operation and were now finally being rebuilt. Federal judges whose careers had been ruined were being reinstated. Journalists who had been silenced were publishing their suppressed investigations. Families that had been torn apart by Richard's manipulations were healing and finding peace. Emma had graduated from medical school the previous week. Her future, now secure and untainted by the threats that had once hung over our heads. She was starting her residency at a children's hospital in Philadelphia, pursuing her dream of becoming a pediatrician without the shadow of Richard's crimes following her. I'm so proud of you, Mom, she had told me at her graduation ceremony. Not just for exposing him, but for showing me that doing the right thing is always worth the cost. Margaret had moved into a smaller house in Georgetown, finally free from the mansion that had been both her prison and her stage for 20 years of pretending. The divorce had been finalized quickly, Richard's guilty plea eliminating any question about asset division or custody arrangements. I'm learning who I am when I'm not afraid, she had told me during our last lunch together. It's terrifying and wonderful at the same time. I'm thinking about going back to school, maybe studying social work. I want to help other women who are trapped in situations they think they can't escape. Sarah had indeed turned down the Georgetown acceptance that had been tainted by her father's corruption, choosing instead to attend a state university on an academic scholarship she had earned entirely on her own merit. She was studying journalism now, determined to continue the work of exposing truth and holding power accountable. Someone has to make sure this never happens again, she had explained to me. Someone has to watch the watchers. Michael was thriving in therapy and had found his voice again, no longer the frightened boy who had cowered at his father's anger. He was building computers for low-income families as a volunteer project, using his technical skills to help rather than hide. The Whitmore family had been fractured by Richard's crimes, but they were rebuilding themselves as individuals with integrity and purpose. Their healing proved that it was possible to escape the legacy of corruption and create something better from the wreckage. Richard himself was serving a 25-year sentence in federal prison, his cooperation with ongoing investigations having earned him a reduced sentence but not redemption. The man who had once controlled Supreme Court justices and FBI directors now spent his days in a 6x8 cell, his empire of corruption reduced to ashes. I had testified at his sentencing hearing, not for revenge, but for the record. My statement focused not on his crimes against me, but on his victims, the families destroyed, the careers ruined, the democracy nearly sold to foreign enemies. Richard Whitmore didn't just break laws, I had told the judge. He broke faith with the American people and with the principles that make our democracy possible. But his greatest crime was convincing good people that they had no choice but to remain silent while evil flourished. The investigation had continued to expand, reaching into corporate boardrooms and foreign intelligence services around the world. Richard's organizational chart had become the foundation for a new understanding of how international corruption networks operated, leading to reforms in government security and oversight procedures. The FBI had offered me a position as a consultant on corruption investigations, recognizing that my experience gave me unique insights into how such networks operated and recruited their victims. I had accepted the offer, finding purpose in helping other victims find their voice and their courage. My new apartment was modest but comfortable, decorated with photographs of Emma at her graduation and letters from the families whose lives had been touched by the exposure of Richard's crimes. I had finally found work that mattered, helping to protect democracy rather than unknowingly enabling its destruction. The thank you letter from Dr. Martinez remained my most treasured possession, not because it praised my actions, but because it represented hope, proof that truth could triumph over power, that courage could overcome fear, that ordinary people could change the world when they chose to act on their principles. As I prepared dinner that evening, I thought about the wine bottle that had started it, all the 1982 Bordeaux that had shattered on Richard's basement floor and led me to discover the hidden door. Such a small accident, such enormous consequences. Sometimes the most important moments in our lives arrive disguised as mistakes or mishaps. Sometimes courage begins with something as simple as refusing to ignore what we've seen, even when ignoring it would be easier and safer. I had been a housekeeper who stumbled into the crime of the century, but I had chosen to become something more: a witness, a fighter, a voice for those who had been silenced. That choice had cost me comfort and security, but it had given me something more valuable: the knowledge that I had done everything in my power to protect the innocent and serve justice. Richard's corruption had nearly succeeded in destroying American democracy, but it had failed because enough people, investigators, journalists, foreign allies, and one frightened housekeeper had chosen courage over complicity. The letter from Dr. Martinez reminded me that individual actions, however small they might seem, could create ripples that changed everything. A broken wine bottle had led to the exposure of the most comprehensive corruption network in American history. A housekeeper's decision to document what she had seen had saved democracy itself. As I sealed my own Latora note to Emma, expressing my pride in her accomplishments and my hope for her future, I reflected on how much had changed since that Tuesday morning when I first discovered Richard's secret. I was no longer the grateful employee, dependent on my employer's kindness and terrified of losing my security. I was no longer the silent witness, carrying the burden of terrible knowledge alone. I was no longer the victim, controlled by fear and threats. I was Elenora Reed, the woman who had helped save American democracy. And for the first time in years, I was truly free. The thank you letter from Dr. Martinez sat on my table like a promise that the future would be better than the past, that truth would continue to matter, and that ordinary people would always have the power to choose what kind of world they wanted to live in. It was enough. It was everything.